Good morning. So myself, Thomas Grimshaw and Trudy Murray are very, very happy and honoured to be speaking to Jacqui Gavin this morning. So Jacqui, would you be happy to just introduce yourself to the world?
Hi, Sarah McCann, and good morning, everybody. So my name's Jacqui Gavin. I work as the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisor and lead for Positive Action with Cambridgeshire Fire and Rescue Service. But I suppose the role that I'm more famous, or some would argue more infamous for, is the role that I played in the Central Civil Service, where I took the journey of trans and what it means to be trans to a whole new level. At the same time as the civil service was reducing its headcount from just over 700,000 civil servants to that of its current level of just over 400,000 civil servants. So I know we've got a lot more questions to ask, Tom, but as I say, that is a little bit of an insight to me. And when we go through the conversation, I'll happily answer all the questions that we have got coming up.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you, Jacqui. So I'll kick off with quite a broad question, I think. So what does it mean to be transgender?
It's a very broad question. So what does it mean to be transgender? I suppose in its simplest terms, it basically means that you identify with a gender that is different to that of your birth sex in its simplest terms. But we know that the trans, in terms of transgender, or trans as it's often shortened to, can be a much wider umbrella, which can include people who identify as a gender that we will see as different, completely parallel, opposite to that of their birth sex. It could be somebody that identifies in a gender that is someplace in between. So it could be non-binary, it could be queer, it could be fluid, and so much more. But that's a whole conversation in its piece, and I'm sure we'll cover many of those kind of things when we go through the conversation.
Thank you, Jacqui. Would you be able to tell us just a bit about your journey as a transgender person?
You're asking a 53-year-old to tell you about your journey? So for me, as I say, yes, I'm a 53-year-old Scot. I was born, as I say, in my native Scotland, in the small market town of St Andrews in the Kingdom of Fife, many, many years ago. As a baby, not that I remember, my mother would recollect in a letter that she wrote probably some 2 days before she died. I was always a shy, quiet, and yet a couthy child. Those of you that are Scottish will know what that meaning means, because couthy basically means cheeky. Some things never change, as they say. It was probably when I was about 10 years old when I first realised there was something a little bit different about me. And that occurred, I suppose, looking through a magazine. I didn't know as a child, but I am dyslexic. I loved looking at pictures. And I remember coming across one particular picture, and it was a picture of a man, not a particularly attractive man, but this picture was black and white, and all the rest of the pictures in the magazine were colour. And I couldn't understand, looking at the picture, why he wasn't happy. Because as a child, we're always taught to smile for a photograph. And as I'm looking at this photograph, I realise he's also sitting there without any clothes on. Again, that was not what attracted me to it. But as I say, it was just the simple fact he wasn't smiling. As I flick over the page to reveal the next image, I have what I can only describe as the sound of 1,000 cannons going off in my mind, because as the page falls to reveal the next picture, it's a picture of the same man in the same pose, but this time he's ripping his skin off. Now, probably what you're thinking is not where I'm coming from, because what he is revealing that under his male exterior is that of a beautiful lady. The smooth skin, the long flowing locks, the perfect makeup, everything that you can imagine. And of course, as a young 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid, I'm running around the house like a loon, shouting at the top of the voice. That's what I feel. And I'm ripping at my skin, trying to find a way to be myself. And of course, back in 1970s Scotland, it was not one of those kind of things that people wanted to be able to do and understand that kind of aspect. I suppose for the next few years, I was going back and forward to psychiatrists to try and, I suppose, get under the skin of what the issue was and why I was feeling this. And doctors prodding me, poking me, trying to tell me, you know, it's not right. Boys can't become little girls. And my parents were encouraged for me to get me to do more male-dominated things, including sport, which I did incredibly well. So well that I became a schoolboy signing for quite a well-known football manager, some guy that people might know, that's soccer to our American cousins, a well-known manager called, I think his name was Alex Ferguson, when he managed a decent football team. That's Aberdeen between you and I. But Fergie got to find out that I was slightly different, and before I knew it, I lost my schoolboy contract, which prompted me to run away from my home in my native Scotland to the streets where the pavements are paved with gold, i.e. where I thought London was to be able to give me that. That allowed me to then explore myself a bit more. From there, sadly, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, meant I had to return home, stop my thought process about becoming the real me, only to then join the military, where I joined the military at a time where being LGBT was not the wisest of things. And of course, the military got to find out that, again, I was slightly different, eventually leading me to leave the military, either that or looking at a military sentence. After I left the military, I then began to really, really promptly go through the process to become the person you see sat before you today. There's a lot more besides within that, but I don't want to take up too much time in the questioning because I know that both Tom and Trudy are going to go into much more details.
Thank you very much for that, Jacqui. It's sad, but also amazing to hear of your journey. It's very inspiring, I must say. So, was there a point in your career that you thought about moving into the promotion of diversity and inclusion in the workplace? You know, that was for you?
It's a very good question. I suppose for a long, long period of time after I transitioned, because the media had their field day when I came out as trans, I woke up to many a headline in the press, including headlines such as, "You're a bit of all right, Jack." Yes, we did say Jack, it's a man. And I just wanted to hide and just have a normal job. But no matter what job I did, I found myself being found out that I was different. And it meant that my career, probably up until the point I joined civil service, was a bit of a patchwork quilt, as I describe it, where I was going from job to job to job to job. Then when I joined the civil service, I again had no envisionment of going into diversity and inclusion, but literally within 2 weeks of joining the civil service, i.e. the Department for Work and Pensions, I received a phone call from the second perm sec, a guy called Terry Moran, who I really admire massively, basically saying on the phone to me saying, "We know all about you." And I'm thinking, here we go again, I've got to explain myself. But literally, it was a cry for help from the organisation to say, can you help us build a process, to be able to get a better understanding about the issues pertaining to what it means to be transgender. That was the opening for me to get into the diversity and inclusion space and really, really make a massive difference to one government department, which then led on to the wider civil service. So yes, I think that was probably the moment where I was able to combine my role as a trans rights activist for as many years as I've been, which up to that probably point in time would have been about 25 years, to then also combining that with my career as a civil servant. So it was a huge opportunity for me. I grabbed it with both hands, and I believe that since then I've really, really been able to shine a real good spotlight in the important places where it needs to be shone on.
Jacqui, so reading your past and your bio, you know, you are incredibly inspiring, and you have done such a lot of amazing work for trans people, but also for diversity and inclusion, generally speaking. And you sort of touched on, you know, when you really moved into that space and you really became sort of active with, certainly in sort of work organisations. But could you just sort of elaborate on a bit more of the work that you've done since you started really feeding into DE&I for organisations and workplaces?
So again, as I said, I mean, I suppose the first and foremost place was obviously the advocacy that I did around trans. Admittedly, that was around what I call binary trans, i.e. the people's going from male to female or female to male. But that obviously then widened to include the wider identities that fall under the trans umbrella. Since then, I've really advocated, and I suppose even at the point when I was doing transgender issues, to me, it's about how we do things collectively, how we ensure that all voices within this space are heard. I mean, yes, I have been that person that's blown the whistle on the Pride marches and shouted and all those kind of things. But to me, if you're going to really make a difference in the diversity space, you've got to hear every single voice, and that includes the voices that we don't always want to hear. These voices are equally as important as the voices that cheerlead who we are and how we identify and ensure we get the rights that we all, hopefully, most of us endure across the globe today. We know there is still a lot to do, but at the moment, I think there's a lot of shouting and not listening. One thing being a civil servant teaches you a lot is to listen, really listen to the voices that are going on in that space. So whenever I do diversity inclusion, that's what I'm about. Let's really hear the full spectrum of every single voice to be able to really move forward together. Because if somebody's spouting out hate, then is it because they don't understand? That's what's important. Get them to understand what it is. And sometimes, you know what? It's about us as people who identify in the way we do, coming to the other person's side of the fence, reaching out that olive branch and saying, come to my side and I'll walk a mile in my shoes. And you know what? I'll walk a mile in your shoes too. Because together we can really make that difference.
No, absolutely. It's about togetherness, and I you know, you just exude that kind of that aura of acceptance and, you know, coming togetherness, for lack of a better word. So on the kind of topic of togetherness, in Pearson we talk a lot about intersectionality. So, you know, no one has one role in their life or one identifying characteristic.
Yeah.
So how important is it to you to ensure that you educate colleagues about diversity and inclusion for all people, not just LGBT plus people?
I am intersectional myself. If I look at myself, yes, I suppose one would argue that for me personally, my number one way of identifying is through my LGBT characteristics. But there is so much more to me. As I say, before I mentioned that I'm dyslexic, so I fall in the disability spectrum. I'm Scottish, so I have an ethnicity about me. There is so much more about every single one of us, because, and through that wholeness of the person, you get to find out so much more. One of the key things that I try to encourage in my current role is that in each of the workplaces, we have 28 fire stations in Cambridgeshire, we have our headquarters, is just to have something that introduces you who you are based on different random statements. Those statements could be absolutely anything, and it doesn't matter what it was. But when people start to see these things about you, they start to question and go, oh, I didn't realize that about you. And that starts a conversation. It creates the authenticity that we want to create in the workplace. that is the most important thing in that kind of context. So that's why, for me, recognizing that we've all got characteristics, many of them about us, and if we can bring those whole things together, it allows us to bring our whole authentic self to the workplace.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, bringing our authentic selves is really important, actually, and it's definitely a value that as Spectrum UK we're trying to sort of highlight in the work that we do. And so a question sort of following on from that, Jacqui, which actually falls really nicely. You have had a great deal of experience working with some very senior people in the UK. You've obviously talked about your civil service roles, but here in Pearson, okay, what would you say to us as Spectrum and also as Spectrum allies about why it's so important for transgender visibility to be seen?
I know personally, speaking from my own personal experience, when I wasn't out, I mean, I mentioned, yes, the media had their field day with me. And when I wasn't able to be really, really out, I know that my career suffered, and my career suffered in a big, big way because I wasn't being true to myself and true to my authentic self. Having somebody that was my private cheerleading squad, if I can put it in that kind of context, really, really made a difference, particularly when Terry Moran gave me that phone call and said, look, I get you, I understand you, I want you now to help me understand how we can get this wider aspect, because we know in many organizations, I call it the permafrost layer. There's that layer where you've got the junior grades and you've got the layer of the more senior grades. Most seniors will say, you know what, we need to do it because it's the right thing to do for the organization. The junior grades are like, I want to be recognized, I just want to be myself because that's who I am. Whereas you have got a traditional barrier, as I call it, the permafrost, or some people will call it the glass ceiling, to really, really break that. So what we've got to do is allow for seniors to be able to break through, to be able to say, look, come on, come up with us on this journey. Isn't it great when we come together, when we come at this collectively? And stopping anything stops that kind of energy, that passion, that hunger coming alive. So if we can do that, and our seniors are senior enough to be able to break down those glass ceilings, as you say, having worked with all the Perm Sex network at the civil service, even working towards number 10, that really was what allowed us to be able to achieve what we needed to do. So Jeremy Haywood, who sadly is no longer with us, was the Cabinet Secretary. And he really, really was the kind of person who turned around to me often and said, what can I do? How can I make this different? How can we get the conversation pieces? And Jeremy was quite a humble man, but when he talked, everybody listened because it was passion, it was hunger, and that's exactly what we want to achieve in this kind of context as well.
Absolutely, I think that is so important. And I'd like to think, I think we'd all like to recognise that we've made some progress forward and some steps in the right direction, but we know it's not a perfect world, unfortunately. So what do you feel are the biggest issues and challenges that kind of face the transgender community today?
I think the trans umbrella, as I previously explained, has got huge, it's got large. And at the moment, there's a lot of voices out there, and there's a lot of voices trying to make sure they're listened to. And yes, that is important. No denying that whatsoever. But I think what we've also seen is that, again, within that trans space, that we see the same faces again and again being the representative faces of trans. Trans is a huge umbrella, and the more we can get more people to be able to come forward and say, this is who I am, this is my story, and talk about it in a way that allows people to understand, and talk about it in a way that allows people to really, really open up and not be frightened about it, and get the voice that of the doubters and the naysayers that don't understand, that often equally shout loud and proud from these little boxes, to come together in a space that is a collective space that really allows us to be able to hear those fears, hear those, what is it that's stopping us from going forward together as one. That to me is the most important thing that we need to get to right now, is that togetherness. As I say, we've become a bit of a society poleaxe because of the fear about what is trans and why are trans people going into this space and should they be allowed in that space. I get frightened about that, all those kinds of things. So rather than being poleaxed, we've got to get back to that point where we come together, get into that middle ground, get into that space where we want to make a difference. That to me is what needs to happen. We need to listen, really, really listen. I keep on saying it, but Tony Blair, and we're not here to get political, but when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, he talked about education, education, education. It's the same in this space as well. We need to educate the people that don't understand about what it means to be us. Otherwise, we will never, ever make people understand. That's what we did when it was binary trans, i.e. male to female or female to male. But the other side as well, including the non-binary identities, need to also equally educate. And we all need to just be prepared to open them. We've got 2 of these for a reason, and 1 of these for a reason.
You raised some really interesting points, and it's so, I mean, because I don't live in the trans world as such, you know, it's so interesting to actually hear of trans being no longer this sort of binary aspect of, as you say, you know, female to male or male to female. And I think that that's going to be something to explore in the future and understand better for myself, as well as for the company. I think, you know, this is all a huge kind of learning curve for sure. You've talked a bit about the challenges, and I want to sort of touch on something that at the moment it's very visible. You know, women's rights to feel safe, women's right to be able to go out on the streets at night and walk anywhere they want to without fear, without kind of wondering what might actually happen next. I wanted to get your thoughts really on how important it is for the transgender community, for trans women, to also feel like they're protected by the criminal justice system, to feel like they're part of the conversations on safer streets, that they're informing the updates to policy that are going to be coming our way, and that they don't feel like there's sort of cisgendered women over here being protected in one way and then transgender women over there kind of being overlooked or ignored. I wondered if I could tease your thoughts on that.
It's an interesting question, Trudy, and I think there will always be a challenge in this area right now, which is the challenge that needs to be explored really, really deeply right now. I think when we look at the legislation, we know that, as I would call it, binary trans people are protected in law in the UK because of the gender reassignment part of the Equality Act, which protects, as I say, those individuals going from male to female or female to male, to give them that specific aspect. Yes, there will always be a challenge because you know that underneath it, that people will still know that there's something slightly different about you, etc., etc. But technically, under the law, you are protected. I think the challenge then comes in with those other identities, those, as I say, non-binary, those fluid, those queer identities, that really, really we need to explore much more. We need to understand, because I would hate it, and this is a personal hate of mine, that if somebody, and I'm not trying to point a finger in any way, shape or form, but say, for example, a man simply put on a frock and simply put on a bit of makeup and a blonde wig, for argument's sake, and was one of those predators out there on that street, to be able to get in the space, and we know how raw that is right now, and something was to happen, then what reflection would that have on the wider trans community? There would be a real outcry, massive outcry, that you're all perverts, you're all this, that, and the next thing. And for most trans people, we just want to get on. We just want to live an authentic life like everybody else. But it would just take one of those occasions for something like that to happen. We know the Yorkshire Ripper used to occasionally dress up in female attire. And Peter Sutcliffe, when he did what he did, he was a horrible, horrible, horrible man who committed some horrible atrocities. And that's why, to me, we need to fully understand what it is about what we're trying to be able to do. I know if I go into female-only spaces in a changing room at the gym or at the swimming pool or whatever, I still feel a little bit self-reserved. If I go into female changing rooms, I still feel reserved, even though I've gone through the full physical transition process. To look at me bodily, I am female, but I still have that fear aspect about being found out, that I'm different. But I am no different to any other female. I'm just wanting to exist. But yes, as I say, I think that's where we need to have a real conversation. And again, I'm going to say it again, we need to listen to every aspect of this full debate to understand what it means for a non-binary person to have the female pronouns or all that kind of understanding, because some people on the other side of the divide are saying, no, you don't deserve that. That's my right to have that still. So let's get into that debate, and a real debate, honest debate, where it's safe to do so.
No, absolutely. Is that conversation needs to kind of happen in its rawest form and its most open form. And like you say, so all voices can be heard, so we can all, and again, it's going back to that theme of inclusiveness and, togetherness, which, Jacqui, you just exude. And it's really lovely. It's honestly, genuinely, it's lovely to see and hear. So previously in Pearson, we've discussed the importance of respecting a person's pronouns and the significance that pronouns have, especially for transgender people. So kind of, again, going back to kind of quite a broad question, when it comes to the transgender community, how are pronouns involved?
So pronouns are, I suppose, an affirmation of you being who you are, being true to yourself, and it's all too easy. I know that for my voice, it's slightly on the deeper side, even though it has that Scottish twang to it. And that can be a real challenge on this kind of medium. It can be a real challenge on the telephone, where somebody could pick up the phone, and because my voice has that slightly deeper tone to it, it'll be like, yes, is that Mr. Gavin? No, it's not Mr. Gavin, it's Ms. Gavin. And you can feel that sort of reservation in the voice. Whereas if I have it on my email signature, or if I have it on something like that, if somebody picks up the phone and I say, good morning, Jacqui speaking, how can I help? Then people will know that they're speaking to Jacqui, the person that was on that email signature strip, so they know that I have got my pronouns, which are she, her, hers. So they know that that's who I am. They may also recognize that I may be on that trans spectrum, but who's to know? I may have had cancer, which has affected my voice, or I may have had any other kind of ailment that has had that impact on me. It's just good practice and good manners to respect those. That's why whenever I do a meeting, I usually try to encourage people to say their pronouns as we're going around the table as well. Because again, if somebody is in that space where they may look what we traditionally assume to be male or traditionally assume to be female, or we're not exactly sure what it is, then just be respectful. Be respectful of the individual. If they tell you it's the female pronouns, or if it's the male pronouns, or if it's the non-binary pronouns, respect that person enough, because it matters to that person immensely. It's the difference of that person being completely in the meeting or in the conversation and not being in the conversation. I still remember not long after I transitioned, where one of the senior managers at the organisation I was working for at the time used my dead name, as I call it, i.e. my previous name, and he's introducing me to this group of people as that, and I'm thinking, I'm not even going to interact with you. And after those visitors left, I went straight over to his desk and said, David, why did you do that? You know that's my dead name. They're looking at me in one way and thinking, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't compute. Just be a bit more respectful of the individual. That's why it's important to me.
Identity is such a huge part of us, isn't it? And having people, as you say quite rightly, respect that is what either builds relationships or really kind of blocks them from even being created in the first place. We're going to focus just a little bit more now about sort of the workplace and being sort of transgender in the workplace, or working with someone who is out and proud and, you know, it feels able to be openly transgender in the workplace, because we recognize that not everyone is. I have a question sort of pulling on your experiences, really, and interesting that you've already kind of led us into this, but what is it that organizations need to do to create safe and inclusive workplaces for the transgender community? Is there specific things, or is it just sort of a wealth of stuff that needs to happen?
There is no denying there is a wealth of things, but the old favourite, particularly in the workplace, usually comes to toilets. That is usually the first question that comes up in terms of if somebody comes out as transgender, what toilets are they going to use? Well, why can't you create the toilet to be just simply a toilet? That's what they are at home. So in the workplace, why can't we do exactly the same? Make the toilets more gender neutral in that kind of aspect. We respect, obviously, that for some, there needs to be that only space. That's why many places will not just make it a toilet. It will be a room where you go in, and then within each of the cubicles, you will have the toilet, you will have the cleaning facilities, all within that one space, rather than actually having a toilet and then sinks outside, because then that's where there can be more of the challenges. So believe me, toilets are the number one issue that always comes up in that kind of context. Within the wider aspect of the workplace, I think it's about creating a culture. Embedding a culture of true inclusiveness isn't always just about a policy or a strategy or anything else like that, because we all like glossy brochures. But more importantly is creating the culture that empowers the individual, again, to be authentic, to be true to themselves, where they're able to just simply turn up, do their job, work to the best of their ability, and you know what? Go home at the end of the evening. Yeah, we're all working from home at the moment, but for most people in the workplace, particularly trans people, it's that getting out that matters to them. It's how they get over the hurdle of being themselves in that kind of aspect. And if we can create that environment and that culture in an organization, that means people are able, again, to be able to be authentic by simply not being fearful about being themselves. That's so important. So yes, let's get the culture right. Let's get the culture where it empowers people to talk about it in an open and transparent way, not through microaggressions, not through anything which makes it difficult, where people are being stared and looked up and down, but just respected for who they are and think, you know what? I like that, what you're wearing. I like what you look like, the way you've done your hair. It's just respecting people enough and having that culture which empowers the conversation in a real way. What did you do at the weekend? Oh, I went out with my wife, my partner, whatever it may be, and not having that fear about talking about it in this sort of invisible sense, making it more visible and being prepared to do that, and people respecting you enough to be able to have that conversation.
Absolutely, and it is that thing. Having the policies in place and the procedures in place is great, but actually the culture and the people of the organisation, you know, that's invaluable. Kind of fostering that culture of inclusivity and acceptance and love. You know, just because we're at work doesn't mean we can't talk about us. You know,
Yeah.
we spend more time at work than we do with our friends and family. So, you know, it is that thing. It's those conversations and hearing kind of some of those actions that organisations can take. You know, it's great to hear. I know Pearson, for example, has introduced some gender neutral toilets in their 2 London offices, for example, and that includes the global office at Strand. So, you know, it's great to hear that. And Pearson, a couple of years ago, introduced official kind of lanyards, one with a pride flag, one with a transgender flag. And the demand across the UK was unprecedented. We kept running out of stock. And to some people, it might seem quite simple, you know, it's just a lanyard. But actually, I would argue, you know, it's a signal from allies. You know, I'm wearing this transgender flag lanyard proudly to show that, you know, you're safe here. You know, we want to talk with you here. And there were conversations, you know, this actually, what do the colours on the transgender flag mean? You know, and to hear, you know, cisgendered people in particular having those conversations and actually talking more about the transgender community, you can see how the culture actually was changing and becoming even more trans inclusive. So it's fantastic to hear, you know, that some of the actions that you've mentioned actually Pearson are doing. But of course, we always recognise that there's always more to do. And so on that note, you know, from your personal experience as an employee, you know, within a wide range of various organisations, and from the work that you've done to promote diversity and inclusion, have you seen examples of what you would call kind of, you know, best practice approaches to creating true diversity, equity, and inclusion for our transgender colleagues?
I think when we look at the workplace, I mean, there is no denying there is not divide, but there is different ways it's looked at. In the public sector, we're all about begging, borrowing, and stealing is the best way I can describe it, because we don't have a lot of money. But in the private sector, you're in a slightly better advantage because you can throw a bit more money at it in that kind of context, which is great in that kind of aspect. But certainly from my experience in the public sector, I think where we started on, when I joined the civil service back in 2008, it was a very, very different world back then. It reminded me best of the TV series Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, the very dark, dingy corridors. And if you heard footsteps outside the corridor, everybody turned and looked. Whereas it became very much a journey in that sort of institutionalized change where we really, really came at this together and realized that, you know what, I may have a policy, but I'm not going to keep it as a secret, because government departments are all too good at saying this is our diversity and inclusion policy and we're not going to share it with anybody. Whereas over the time, we began to become together at this and say, right, okay, let's see what DWP's inclusion policy looks like or strategy looks like. Let's see, and then compare that to the Home Office, and then compare that to the Ministry of Silly Walks, and so on and so forth, where we're able to come together collectively and be able to create what then became the Civil Service D&I strategy, which was launched, I think it was 2018, if memory serves me right. It was either the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, which had the collective voice that meant that the 400,000+ civil servants in the UK were represented in one document. And it really allowed us to be able to ensure that the trans voice was seen as an independent voice that really represented that wide umbrella as well. So we spent a lot of time breaking it down into gender, race, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the much wider umbrella beside. to really get to understand these ones. And then, of course, then we built in faith and other protected characteristics as well to carry that voice, because I think that's what makes the difference. If you build a strategy that has the voice of the people within it, that's the difference between something that sits on the shelf gathering dust or something that really is going to make that difference. Because a strategy, as I say, is important, but behind that is an action plan of outcomes and output that you're going to really do to make the difference as well.
I think we're, as an organisation, we're becoming so much better actually at acknowledging our global status and of not keeping things sort of geographically held in, you know, sort of in the past, Spectrum UK, just using us as an example, would have created something that was just for the UK. We wouldn't necessarily have pulled in sort of other colleagues from other geographies. And I do think, and certainly in the last sort of couple of years for sure, it's become so much more important actually that we do involve our other colleagues across the world, across the globe, because they give us such a different perspective or a different outlook or a different experience that we've not necessarily considered ourselves, because that's not our, you know, our location or our geography or our culture or our society. And it is so important, I think, as you say, to kind of bring a group of people together who are able to vocalize and share what's going on. You know, we do have things like trans hiring guidelines and various things like that, and it's wonderful to create that kind of thing. However, what we need to do is actually be a lot more overt about it and a lot more obvious about it, and shout about it, really, because, you know, how many other organizations do have that kind of thing? You know, it is making sure that we are much more obvious publicly, I think, as well as internally, about the kind of work that we do and the importance that it has. And, you know, we've talked a bit, I might have mentioned a couple of times, that Spectrum is a global kind of a network, which means that we're so fortunate, really, because part of our network is not only people who identify on the LGBT plus spectrum. We have a great number of allies, and we rely a lot on our allies because they've got experiences, they've got viewpoints, they want to be able to sit and listen. These allies, you know, that's part of the reason that they want to join with us. So we never lose sight, really, of how important they are. Do you have any recommendations that we as a company could sort of take forward, really, in how we build much stronger transgender allies for our transgender colleagues and, you know, for society as a whole?
Doing things like this is a classic example of that, hearing the voice of the trans individual, because believe me, you put a spotlight on a trans person and the challenge is getting the spotlight off that person, because we do have a tendency to like that kind of aspect, because it allows us to be able to talk honestly and authentically. So that, to me, is a really, really important thing. You know, what I'm going to say next is listen. I keep on talking about that, but again, I cannot stress that enough, that you just listen and look out for that aspect and really get into that space where you're being guided by the individual, by what it is right for them. Because everybody thinks when somebody is transgender that there is a certain sort of rule book or there's a certain sort of process that needs to actually happen. I'm a great believer there is no one size fits all. We've got to get in that kind of context that we recognize that every single trans person is an individual and we need to respect them enough for that. So be guided by the individual, recognize that they may need different needs, they may need different kind of aspects. They may go on, when they step on this path, they'll go at their own pace. Don't say to them, right, okay, you've got 2 years starting. Now, give them that space to understand what it is that they want to be able to do within that kind of context. Be prepared. is, again, an important thing. So all too often I hear within organizations, oh, we weren't ready for it. We need to create a policy. We need to create some guidance. We need to do this. Be ahead of the curve and do something so that you've got that. I mean, you mentioned what you mentioned, Trudy, in terms of that information, which is fantastic that an organization is prepared to do that kind of aspect. So to me, that's 1-0 to Pearson, because you've done that. So again, anything like that you can do, have that visibility out there as well by, again, I mentioned previously about having different things of random pictures of people throughout the organisation. Include your trans people in that space. Include your allies. If there is somebody that's an ally on the staff passes, you mentioned about lanyards, Thomas, great to see, but it may be something as simple as a little spot on your staff pass or whatever. I wear this badge, which is my Cambridgeshire Fire and Rescue Service badge, which is for the LGBT perspective. But it's little things like that that make it visible. I mean, it could be something as simple as having a sticker on the back of the laptop. So when you open your laptop and say, I am a trans ally, that can be a difference for a trans person in the room, where they can suddenly think, oh, there's somebody in the room that I can feel that's going to be on my side and understand who I am. So it's just, to me, visibility plays a huge, huge role. Get the flag flying whenever it's Trans Day of Visibility on the 31st of March. Get it flying at half-mast on Transgender Day of Remembrance. I know it's the Queen's wedding anniversary as well, but you can do it after dark, honestly, I know. But just little things like that that show that you're prepared to do that. Have panels, discussions, whatever it may be. And don't just have the trans person on that panel. We're having this conversation now. And again, bringing in those wider aspects, get the chief exec to talk about it, get the person who's new in the organisation to understand what's part of their induction package. These things, as I say, it's that visibility that we take diversity and inclusion serious. And one of those areas is trans inclusion as well.
Absolutely. And as we've discussed today, we've seen that you've had such a fantastic career, history, and you've had loads of different perspectives within loads of different organizations. And you've seen, what organizations have been doing, and you've seen examples of good practice. And of course, in your career history, part of that was at Pearson. So I think, and that nicely leads me on to our, unfortunately, final question of the day. During your time at Pearson, what was your experience like as a transgender colleague, as a transgender employee of Pearson? When you consider the support and the practices that you've seen other organizations give to their transgender employees, do you have any advice for us on how to keep moving forward with transgender inclusion at Pearson?
Being brutally honest, my experience at Pearson, I loved the organisation. It was a challenging time for me. There is no denying that. And I do recognise it. I think I was going through a lot of personal issues at the time, but also I just felt the organisation at that time didn't fully understand what it was to be transgender. I wasn't out, and of course there was a lot of Chinese whispers would go on within the organisation, which I suppose stopped me from being my complete authentic self. Since then, I know through friends that I've still kept in touch with, including good people here, that the organisation has come on an enormous journey. Let's be honest. I mean, I know it probably started with Marjorie Scardino, then on to Jim Fallon, and so on and so forth. And the organisation keeps moving forward. It's almost like the Walt Disney quote, we keep moving forward, opening new doors, creating new opportunities. And that is the Pearson way. The Pearson way is about creating those opportunities, creating new products, always being in that kind of context about looking at new things, new technologies. I mean, the Pearson organisation, from what it was when it first started as a construction organisation to where it is now today as an education, a world education leader, it shows that as an organisation you can evolve. And that is the great thing about Pearson. You are evolving. I mean, here we are having this conversation, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing to be able to do. And you're building yourself into that kind of place where you want people, you want the best talent, you want the best people to come and work for the organisation. And you know what? You will get there because of that, this embracement that you're going through, where you're embracing people with different lived experiences, including trans, is wonderful to see. So in the words of Disney, as I say, keep moving forward, opening those new doors and creating those new level of opportunities.
Jacqui, it's been so wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us. It would be, you know, absolutely wonderful to keep our relationship going. Actually, I think for Tommy and I certainly, and for Spectrum, it would be a huge benefit for us to continue working with you as we move forward and continue on our journey, because it is a continuous journey. You know, we're never going to stop, because you know, nothing stops, does it? When you're an activist and you're trying to promote rights and diversity and equity and inclusion for people, it is a continuing journey all the time. And we're really keen to keep making progress in that area. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Anytime. And as I say, I would be more than delighted to help in anything that you need.